Right, welcome back again. This is our next event is more roundtable style than formal panel. But what we will do first is I will first introduce our distinguished speakers, and then I will ask every speaker to do a 5-minute or so opening, to give 5 minutes of opening remarks. Then we'll have some moderated discussion. I'll pose some questions, and then we'll have an audience discussion at the end. So let me introduce the speakers in alphabetical order. First of all is my dear friend and colleague, Professor Boaz Ganor, who is the Dean of the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya in Israel. He's also the Lauder Chair for Counter-Terrorism at the Lauder School, the founder and executive director of the Institute for Counter-Terrorism at Herzliya, which is actually one of ICSR's, for those of you who don't know this yet, one of ICSR's 5 main partner institutions. He's a leading authority in counterterrorism, who's held various positions as a visiting lecturer, fellow, including at Stanford and Berkeley, serves on several international advisory boards of a number of institutions, briefed or provided testimony before the UN and various institutions such as US Congress, the Australian Parliament, and the author of several books on terrorism, most recently Global Terror Alert, The Rationality of Modern Islamist Terrorism and the Challenge to the Liberal Democratic World, which has just been published earlier this year with Columbia University Press. Dr. Thomas Hegghammer is the Director of Terrorism Research at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, FFI. He held fellowship positions at Princeton University, including at the Institute for Advanced Study there, at the Belfer Center at Harvard, and he was a Zuckerman Fellow at Stanford University, at CSAC at Stanford. He's currently also an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo, and among his many publications and books is an acclaimed book, Jihad in Saudi Arabia, published with Cambridge in 2010. He's currently working, as you've heard, on completing a biography of Abdullah Azzam, and his articles have been published in leading academic journals, including the American Political Science Review, International Security, and he's also been briefing British Parliament, US Congress, the Canadian Senate, and other. Professor Peter Neumann is, as you all know, the Professor of Security Studies at the Department of War Studies here at King's College, and who has served as the director of the ICSR since its foundation in early 2008. He also has written numerous books on terrorism and counterterrorism. Today he just handed to me a signed copy of his latest book, Die neuen Jihadisten, The New Jihadists, which has already made it to the bestseller list in Germany for the 2nd consecutive week. Prior to this, Professor Neumann has authored or co-authored 5 other books, including Old and New Terrorism, The Strategy of Terrorism, which is a really great book, which I use in my class with MLR Smith. He's an advisor to the Club of Madrid. He served as a senior consultant for the US mission to the UN. He has given evidence before the UN Security Council, as well as committees of the US House of Representatives, the UK House of Commons, the Canadian House of Commons, and the European Parliament. So a very, very distinguished panel. The topic for the panel today is Confronting Global Jihadism, Challenges and Responses. So this is going to be kind of a very kind of policy-oriented panel that looks at countering this phenomenon which we've been discussing today. And I will ask the panelists to give their remarks in alphabetical order. So Boaz, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Assaf. I think we had a remarkable day, and I hope we would meet the expectations that have been built up in the last 2 panels. In February 2015, President Obama asked the approval of the Congress to start a war, no less than that, on ISIS. A few days ago, or 2 weeks ago, President Hollande defined the situation as a war between France and ISIS. And when we are talking about a war, all those world leaders are in a war against ISIS. We should ask ourselves the preliminary question. What are we facing? The question I pose to myself is, who's the enemy? What is the rationale of the enemy? Actually, I should start, based on the previous discussion, who are we? But I will leave this aside. I think I know who we are. And by the way, the answer to who are we is all the people which are believe in liberal democratic ideas, that believe in civil society, that believes in women liberation, in the rights of minority. That's who we are. Westerners, non-Westerners. And then the question is who we are facing. Who is the enemy? And that's why I asked the previous panel, what is the common denominator of all of those organizations? The enemy is a combination of all of those organizations. We need to analyze each and every one of them. But we need to understand that we are not in a war with an organization, nor with ISIS, nor with Al-Qaeda, nor with Al-Shabaab, nor with Boko Haram. We are in a war with an ideology. We are in a war with a religious ideology. Now, you know, here I am standing a Jew in London and preaching to the crowd and saying we are in a war, in a political religious war. It's important for me to emphasize, and I'm emphasizing that not because I'm trying to be politically correct, that we are not in a war between religions. We are not facing a war with Islam. Nobody is facing a war with Islam. Nobody should face a war with Islam. Those people that I referred before, has no problem with Islam whatsoever. But there is a problem within Islam. And there is a war within Islam. And we, as outsiders, just suffer from the implications of the internal war in Islam, which is being conducted today. If ISIS would lose the war, if the war against ISIS will be successful, then there will be a second ISIS, and the third one, and a fourth one, a new fashion. The international community should find a way to deal with the ideology that gives birth to those organizations. And when I'm talking about finding a way to deal with these concepts and ideology, the second question that is being posed is not just who's the enemy, is what is the root cause that gives birth to this ideology? There are many concepts and ideas around the world. We just heard immediately after the terrible terrorist attack in Paris, the Swedish foreign minister, who actually understands what the root cause of the terrorism, the radicalization processes, and so on. So it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some other people refers to occupation, some other people refers to poverty, corruption in the Muslim world, many, many reasons altogether. I would like to suggest to differ between two different types of causes or motivations or grievances. Root causes versus or compared with instrumental causes. All of those causes that I've mentioned, occupation, poverty, corruption, colonialism, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all of those are causes for radicalization. But all of those are instrumental causes and not root causes. And we should not mix between the two. The root cause is, once again, this misinterpretation of Islam that actually push people to promote violence and terrorism in order to impose their perception of Islam all over the world. The problem is that the international community, those liberal Democrats around the world, some of them, many of them, are reluctant to call a spade a spade. And some of them prefer to sweep the dust under the rug, to not connect any religion or misinterpretation of religion to those atrocities that we are facing. What we see in the last few years is a very dangerous trend, in my view, which is a shift from the concept of counter-terrorism into the concept of CVE, countering violent extremism. And why? Again, in order to be politically correct, in order to appease. Now, don't get me wrong. It's crucial to find a way to hold hand in hand with the majority of the Muslim world around the world who doesn't accept these Salafi jihadist concepts. It's crucial to find a way to promote the Muslim religious clerics which are moderate and pragmatics. But how do you do that? Are you trying to do that by politically correctness? Or you need to have an open discussion with them? You need to pose the fact that there is a problem in Islam right now that needs to be dealt by them. And by the way, they need to deal with that, not in order to do any favor to me, to Jews, to Christians. They need to save Islam from the Islamists, because Islam is going or being pushed by a small minority and very dangerous one to a very dangerous position that threaten what they believe in Islam. I'm not an Islamic religious cleric. They know what Islam is, and they know how dangerous this trend is. They need to stand against this dangerous trend. So the question, can we achieve that by suggesting those great ideas of countering violent extremism? You know, I was listening to the last panel, I think what was the last panel. And I think it was Shiraz. Shiraz is here, I don't see Shiraz. I think it was Shiraz that was saying, well, you know, Al-Qaeda wants to show that they are not that extremists. The ISIS are the extremists. So when we are dealing with the question of CVE or counterterrorism, bear this in mind. For many, many people around the world, Al-Qaeda becomes not a very extremist element. So CVE doesn't refer to Al-Qaeda, at least by the views of those specific people. CVE is a wrong and dangerous term. So I want to wrap up, and as you can understand, I wanted to raise the discourse here to this dispute. I want to actually to sum up by saying that, in my view, the first task that we have is to identify the enemy, to identify and understand the rationale of the enemy, the cost-benefit analysis of the enemy, and deal with this specific enemy, countering the motivation, countering the root causes, but do it in a way that you confront it, and you pose the task to the moderate Muslims around the world, suggesting them any offer, any support that they need. But it's their task, not our task. And they need to do that, because if they won't do that, they would face Islamophobic reaction, which started, and it's it's growing and growing and growing. That is for their sake, to deal with those internal extremists that they have today in Islam. Thank you very much.
So there's so much to say about countering global jihadism, about various policies. There are so many different questions about what to do with IS on the ground, what to do with radicalization in the West, and all this sort of stuff. I can't possibly cover it all, so I figured I would just focus on what I talked about earlier, about the online online dimension and kind of finish my argument and just say a few words about what I think we can and should do to police the internet better. Explained in my As I explained in my talk, it is important to do this to limit, for several reasons. First, to limit the distribution of this material. The more people are exposed to jihadi propaganda, the more people are going to radicalize. So we have to limit that. We also have to limit the ability of operatives to exploit the internet for things like recruitment, fundraising, operational coordination. So what I've been arguing and what I also argued in my short piece in the New York Times Room for Debate is that we have to do more of aggressive online policing of the kind that we did in the 2000s. What does this involve in practice? Well, some of it is easy to do. Some of it is much more complicated and requires a lot of debate. But there's some low-hanging fruit, like just taking down static websites, taking down blogs on places like Tumblr and elsewhere. This is very easy to do. We did it systematically in the 2000s. No reason why we shouldn't be able to do it today. We should also work with, and if necessary, force by law, I think, the social media giants to police their platforms better. This obviously is, will raise the big debate about what exactly should we police, what should be censored. Here we need a big open debate, a global debate about some rules and guidelines. But I just want to, it's useful to remind people that there already are guidelines for this. The companies themselves have staked out certain rules. They're just not always enforcing them today. In addition to this sort of low-hanging fruit, I think the security services should consider doing more of the kind of things that we did in the 2000s, more infiltration and sort of information operations designed to undermine the trust, the interpersonal trust on social media and on other kind of communication platforms online. There will still be a lot of problems that are of a technological nature that we can't sort of solve by decree, like encryption and that sort of thing. And so in those cases we'll have to deal with it in another way. But I think there's still a lot we can do that is simply a matter of political will and of finding a kind of an approach that many people can agree on. Now, I'm acutely aware that this is very sensitive territory. That we all want online privacy, and nobody wants a sort of a Stasi type thought police online. So there clearly has to be an open debate about this. But I want to cite sort of at least three kind of reasonable arguments in favor of more online policing. Why this shouldn't be as scary as it may sound. The first reason is that a lot of what jihadis are doing today on the internet is already illegal. They're already breaking the law. It's just not being policed. It's not having any consequences. So if we disagree, if we think that that it's wrong to do this type of policing, then we should change the laws as well. But politicians have decided on certain laws because they for reasons, and we should follow them up. Secondly, the second reason is that there is
clearly a difference between free speech and broadcasting. This is an important point that J.M. Berger makes in his ISIS book, that yes, we should protect free speech, and it's a right. People have a right to kind of express their opinion, unless it's a death threat, something like that. But a few people would argue that it's a human right to get airtime on television to express one's opinion. And several of these platforms are effectively broadcasting instruments. They're not simple kind of bilateral communication tools. They're broadcasting instruments, in many ways like a television network. And it is not a human right to deploy them. And thirdly, what we're talking about here is not really a kind of a radically new regime, a sort of a military takeover of the internet. We're talking about a return to something that it was. It's not the policing that would be new. It's the lack of it now that's new. So I think we can. There are things we can do that should not necessarily infringe too much on free speech and on privacy. Just a final point. I think security services can help with it. They can make things easier for themselves. They can help. They can contribute to this public debate by being more open, by sharing information, sharing examples of the kinds of challenges that they're facing. There's a big. I think one of the big problems today in the debate is that the heads of security services are calling for many of these types of kind of measures. Several heads of intel services have gone to their respective parliaments and called for kind of things like this. But a lot of people don't trust them, don't believe them, and I think it's largely because they don't. Civil society doesn't see the problem. They don't see how large the problem is and the types of issues that they're facing. I think services can help persuade publics by being more open about the kinds of challenges that they are facing. Being specific, concrete. It's not enough to say we have problems breaking encryptions. That's kind of too abstract. They need to bring in some real concrete, specific cases of what has happened and why that was a problem and what it led to and that kind of thing. And I'm a little bit optimistic at this point because I think we have seen some signs in the past 6 months that that there is a little bit more policing than there was about a year ago. It could be, if we're lucky, it could be that in this sort of cat and mouse game between governments and non-government actors, that the kind of the high point of the non-government actors was reached sometimes this spring or last autumn, that their governments are now catching up. But at least we should be aware of this dynamic, and we should be aware that we need to catch up with the jihadis online. That's.
Well, thank you very much. I want to try to stick to 5 minutes. Oops, maybe not. And I want to just make a couple of points and a few practical suggestions. The first goes back to everything that we've talked about today, which is the question, why is it so difficult to fight ISIS, and what is ISIS? And I think the two questions are connected, because the reason it is so difficult to fight ISIS is because ISIS is not one thing, it is in fact several things. Yes, it is a terrorist group, as we saw in Paris. Yes, it is an ideology, as Boaz pointed out. Yes, it is an insurgent army, as Assaf pointed out. And in fact, whether we like it or not, de facto it is also a state. And in defeating ISIS, we're not only fighting against a state or against a terrorist group or against an ideology or against an insurgent group, we're fighting against all four of them at the same time. And not only is it an ideology, it is a transnational ideology that has supporters in many parts of the world. That's why I think it is so difficult to fight against ISIS. Because as we're now concentrating on fighting against the state, there may in fact be an adverse reaction from the terrorist group in response to fighting the state. That makes it very complicated. Here's a couple of things that I believe are important that should be done. I don't know in every case how they should be done. That's up to the policymakers, but this is where I would put the priority. And I want to split it between fighting Islamic State and Islamic State-inspired terrorism here in Europe, and fighting Islamic State in its core territory, which is Syria and Iraq. Personally, I do not think that the end of the Islamic State will come about as a result of the airstrikes that are currently happening. I think the airstrikes are important, and I may be alone in this room in arguing that the airstrikes so far over the past 14 months have in fact been quite successful. They have been quite successful in stopping the advance of ISIS. Let's remember, or if you don't remember, try your newspapers and read the headlines from last summer when talk was about ISIS being about to capture Baghdad, ISIS about to capture Jordan, ISIS attacking the land of the two holy mosques in Saudi Arabia. There was a sense of inevitability about ISIS's success. And I can tell you, as someone who is part of a research team who looks at the motivations of people who are going over there, that this air of success was a strong motivating factor for a lot of people who became foreign fighters and went to Syria and Iraq. ISIS, in its core territory, is no longer successful. The airstrikes and the military support for people who are fighting ISIS, like the Kurds and the Iraqi army, have basically deprived ISIS of its military successes and also of the air of success that has been so successful in marketing its brand, attracting people from across the world. So I don't think the airstrikes, as limited as they have been a complete failure. They have stopped ISIS, they have contained ISIS. And here's the second important point, namely that what you now have as core territory of ISIS in Iraq and Syria is not actually, as we have seen today, a viable economic and political proposition. People are already unhappy within that territory, and as we learned this morning, this entity, which is essentially relying on funding from within itself, will not be able to replenish its material income forever. That means if we continue to aggressively contain ISIS, both militarily, financially, economically, ideologically, and politically, this entity will at some point implode because it is not viable. So the airstrikes will not bring down ISIS, but they are one of a number of instruments that I believe, with some patience, and I'm talking about maybe 2 or 3 years, will lead to the implosion of ISIS. How will it come to an end? Yassine asked the question today. How does the end of ISIS in its core territory look like? Well, of course, they will not just pack in and say, okay, that's it. I imagine the end of ISIS to be very similar to the end of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in the mid-2000s. Namely that some of the core supporters of ISIS currently is 30 to 40,000 people strong in its core territory. It can mobilize 200,000 people because it has the support of key tribes in Syria and Iraq. Tribes, as we learned in the mid-2000s in Iraq, are highly opportunistic. If ISIS no longer is capable of satisfying the demands for privileges, the material demands that it currently hands out to the tribes, those tribes may be in a position to switch loyalty and actually go against ISIS in the same way in which the tribes went against Al-Qaeda in Iraq in the mid-2000s. In that scenario, you actually have a sustainable success. a sustainable success because it is the people from within these territories themselves who bring about the change. It is not Western ground troops who are occupying these territories. It is people from Iraq and Syria who are going against ISIS in the same way in which, on a much smaller scale, they went against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Do I think this is imminent? Do I think this is going to happen within the next 2 or 3 months? No. But I think it is the only sustainable and viable scenario whereby ISIS in Syria and Iraq will come to an end, and we should, in the West and everywhere else, think about how we can speed up that process. And part of speeding up that process is having these airstrikes, but not to the extent that they are actually producing a confrontation with the West. It is about aggressively containing the territory economically, financially, politically, and ideologically. That's my recommendation for the core territory. It requires patience, and of course, every time a terrorist attack in the West happens, people want a solution within 2 or 3 weeks. I don't think there is a solution within 2 or 3 weeks, but there may be a solution within 2 or 3 years, which does require patience, which I understand is politically a difficult proposition when people are demanding quick solutions. In Europe, the situation or the challenge is a different one. In Europe, the challenge is that we have seen a mobilization of this movement that Boaz was talking about, but of this ideological movement that is unprecedented. The numbers of people who have gone from countries like Britain, but even more so from countries like Belgium, France, Denmark, Sweden, Holland, is bigger than anything we have ever seen before. And it came not only to the Americans, but to every single European security service as a big surprise. Security services in countries like Belgium simply do not have the capacity to deal with the problem. I can tell you that a member of the Belgian security service told me about 4 or 5 months ago that there are 120 people who have been to Syria and Iraq who've already returned to Belgium. And I was asking him, how many of them are you watching? He said, the answer is 0. We're not having the capacity to watch a single one of these returnees because for the past 2 years, we have been firefighting. We're trying to prevent people from going. We're trying to prevent terrorist plots from happening. We do not have the manpower to watch these people. And even in larger European countries, like, for example, Germany, I was recently told that it's a great time to be an organized criminal right now, because all the units that used to be deployed to monitor organized crime have all been deployed to fighting terrorism and travelers to Syria. There are practically no resources left in certain parts of policing. So it's great if you want to start a mafia-type organization in Europe. This is the time to start because no one will pay attention to what you're doing. So there's a huge problem with capacity in European countries. It's almost certain, I would say, that more attacks are going to happen. How can you resolve this? Here are 3 things that need to be done. First thing is, what has become very clear in the case of Paris is that the cooperation between European security services is an absolute scandal. An agency like Europol, which was created to facilitate the exchange of information between European countries, is basically without data. Only 4 countries in Europe have actually supplied data on foreign fighters to the foreign fighter database that is located at Europol. It's an absolute scandal. And you cannot have free movement of people if you keep in place the hurdles and the obstacles to cooperation between the security services. They're 2 sides of the same coin. If you pull down borders, you have to pull down the hurdles to cooperation between security services. And the case in Paris has absolutely laid bare how little cooperation still takes place, even though people always used to say, oh, it's gotten much better and it's working now. And we had to trust these comments, and now we know that was an absolute lie. It's not working whatsoever. That's the point number 1. The second point is, of course, we do have to increase the capacity of security services. A country like Belgium was never, the security agencies in a country like Belgium never created for the numbers of people that they have to deal with right now. Of course, even though none of us want like a sort of an overbearing state, to some extent, the capacity of these security agencies and the numbers of people that are being deployed to fighting terrorism have to be increased sensibly. But that cannot happen overnight. You cannot add 4,000 people to MI5 in the next couple of months. This is a slow process that will play out over a number of years. And the third point is that, of course, given that you will never have the capacity to deal with this threat in its entirety, you will then also have to think about things like prevention and things that are not just about people in uniform doing things, but also members of civil society actually taking action that can be as effective as traditional counterterrorism, but that is not being administered by people who are belonging to security services. I've been to a number of initiatives that are actually under the label of CVE and that are hugely effective. For example, I've been to 3 initiatives in Germany where parents who are worried about their kids going to Syria can actually get very effective help and consultancy, almost advice on what to do in order for their kids to be prevented to go to Syria. And they can tell you numerous stories about how they have been very, very successful in stopping their kids from going to Syria. The problem is that these initiatives are completely underfunded. There's an initiative in the city of Bremen, for example, which is now responsible for 150 cases, 150 parents across all of northern Germany, all of whom have kids who are about to travel to Syria. And that initiative gets funding from the state for exactly 1 full-time position. So you can imagine that under those conditions, it is virtually impossible for them to do their work. And I think it has something to do with the fact that we still do not fully recognize that security isn't always something that is done by people in uniforms, but that members of civil society, even initiatives that involve social workers and youth workers, can actually make an effective contribution to the fight against terrorism too. That is partly what CVE is about. It is about activating those civil society actors and making them more effective, realizing that security agencies cannot do 100% of the work. And in a free society, we do not want overbearing security services. So that's an area where we have to do a lot more work. I realize, and that's what I'm going to finish with, that none of this is going to happen overnight. I think this is now maybe an opportunity, but an urgent opportunity to talk about all of these things. I am hopeful that at least some of these things might actually happen in the next year or so. Really keen to hear what you think. Thank you. So there you go.
Thank you very much. All right. I think we have ample opportunity for discussion. I would like to first ask the speakers if they would like to respond to the other panelists, specifically Boaz. I'm sure you have a lot to respond to. And I would also like to ask you, Boaz, a follow-up question. If you think that the enemy is mainly an ideology, what does that mean for counterterrorism policy? So how should we fight this ideology? And I would like to pose the same message also to Peter. And to Thomas, I would like to get your opinion also on how do you see the nature of the threat? Do you see it as, do you share Peter or Boaz's take?
Thank you. I first would like to refer to some of the things that we heard from Peter, and I will combine the answer, how we fight that in my answer. My first argument is ISIS is not and will not be a state. And I would suggest even to stop calling that the Islamic State, although they refer to themselves as the Islamic State. I would refer to them as IS or ISIS, not even giving them the privilege to be called an Islamic State. That's exactly what they want, that in a scholarly meeting in London, we would refer to them as an Islamic State. They are not. A state is an entity which is acknowledged by the international community, by other states, by international tribunals. The ISIS is not a state, not have been, and probably will never be. So that's the first thing. What is ISIS? ISIS is a hybrid terrorist organization, no different than other hybrid terrorist organizations. And what is a hybrid terrorist organization? First of all, who has been? IRA was a hybrid terrorist organization. Fatah was a hybrid terrorist organization. Today, Hamas is a hybrid terrorist organization. Hezbollah is a hybrid terrorist organization. A hybrid terrorist organization is an organization which controls territory and people, and therefore find itself engaged in giving services to those people, being engaged in welfare activity, in education, in health, in supplying food, and so on and so forth. They are not different. And you're saying that it's much more difficult to fight ISIS because ISIS is a terrorist organization, it's an ideology, and it's a state. I beg to differ. It's not more difficult to fight ISIS because of those reasons, because all the terrorist organizations are terrorist organizations that are coming from a certain this or the other ideology, anarchist, Marxist, communist, and so on and so forth. And as I said before, they are not a state. What makes it more difficult to fight them is that they're drafting Allah into this war. They are representing themselves as a religious Muslim or Islamist organization, and that's why it's difficult. It's much more difficult because when religion is being dragged into a political conflict, it's much more difficult to deal with this specific one, regardless which religion, by the way. So I suggest that the reason why it's difficult to fight them is a different reason altogether. And as for the so-called success of the military air campaign, when the Western countries, the leaders of the Western countries refer to this campaign as a war, no less than a war. I didn't suggest the term war. It's Obama's idea, it's Holland's idea, it's the European concept. This is a war. Air campaigns against hybrid terrorist organizations in general, terrorist organizations that control territory and population, would never achieve the goal of this victory on this organization. I can tell that from a very long experience of Israel. Without ground operations, boots on the ground, you would never prevail in a campaign against a hybrid terrorist organization. So, airstrikes, you refer to that as some kind of limited success. Well, they succeeded to stop the occupation of new territories by ISIS. That's true. That you can do with campaigns. By the way, if you ask me, I'm not that sure that the American-led campaign brought that. Because if you analyze the American-led campaign in the last 14 months or so, they have launched about 5 to 10 airstrikes a day. The Russians are launching today about 145 airstrikes a day, and you can understand the difference. And you can see the difference of the influence on the military situation of ISIS after Russia was started to be involved in this specific campaign. As for Europe, and that goes back to your question, how do we fight? If it's an ideology, how do we fight it? Again, we don't need to invent the wheel time and again. You fight terrorism by using a simple equation, which I call it the counter-terrorism equation or the terrorism equation, that has two factors: countering the motivation that gives birth to terrorism, and countering the operational capability of the terrorists. You cannot do one of the two. Many leaders around the world are sticking to one part of this equation. Either they understand the need to fight terrorism, but they disregard the need to deal with grievances, motivations, and so on and so forth. Or they are focusing in the grievances and motivations, doesn't really understand why do we need to fight them. First of all, my friends, when you are being attacked by terrorists, you need to fight them. Why? You need to be proactive. There is no other way to stop terrorism but by being proactive, especially, by the way, when you deal with suicide attacks, that once the suicide attacker was sent to his mission, he's already going to blow himself. So you need to be proactive to prevent it. You need to fight it.
Right? You need to deal with the grievances and you need to deal with the ideologies. How to deal with the ideologies? Go back to what I've said before. To deal with the ideology, you need to identify the provokers, the messages, the common denominators of those people, and to find the people that can counter that. The only one who can counter that are Muslim religious clerics, which they are there. The vast majority of the Muslim society and the Muslim religious pundits do not hold those values. If you think that you can persuade them to do this important job by appeasement, by politically correctness, I wish that you would be right. I tend to believe that the only way is by calling a spade, defining the enemy, and explaining that this is their task for their own sake, not for the sake of the Western society or Europe or anybody else.
Thank you. Thomas, what's your take on how should we see the Islamic?
Just one moment.
Okay.
Thomas, you forgive me that I rushed in for one moment. There is one thing that Peter was mentioning, and rightly so, the need to have better international cooperation. But I suggest much more than a better international cooperation. I suggest what I refer to as a joint international campaign against the terrorism. This is a different level of international cooperation. What is needed to be done in this respect is to have international institutions that will be funded as a joint institution to fight terrorism. Your internet police definitely can be one of them, because there is no need that everybody will waste the money and efforts, and the same effort is being done in the United States and in European countries and in Israel and so on and so forth. This is a joint task to deal with this radicalization process, operational activity over the net, and it can be done jointly. One can build international units that will work together. For example, you have hostage barricade situations. You have negotiation teams. They need to be skillful to deal with Islamist jihadists that capture terrorists. You know, to negotiate with terrorists today is different than negotiation in hostage barricade situation in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. The psyche is different. And with all due respect, I am not sure that Kenya has that, or Somalia has that, or you know what, even Belgium has this capability. So you can have an international negotiating team that will be brought to negotiate with the terrorists. You can have an international R&D association. You know how many money is being now spent on R&D on counter-terrorism technologies. And the same efforts are being copycat in Europe, in the United States, in Australia, and Israel. It all can be coordinated in a joint R&D association, international R&D association. This is a different concept altogether, but it can never be done if we do not agree who's the enemy and what are we fighting against. And that's why this is the crucial element to achieve.
So let's see if we agree on that. So Thomas, in your opinion, who is the enemy, and how does that affect how we should fight it?
It depends on who we are. I think here the question of we is very important. I think it's not helpful to over aggregate these. There are common denominators, there are some bottom lines, and I do generally like to call a spade, but it's not worth calling a spade if it hurts you. If simplifying too much makes you do things that are not helping or even counterproductive, then it's not helping. And I think that if we have learned, to go back to the question in the last session, what have we learned? How well do we understand this phenomenon? And I would say that one of the great advances in kind of jihadi studies, and Reuven was, you contributed to this more than anyone else, has been, the realization that this is a nuanced, this is a multifaceted movement. In the months, or perhaps a year or two after 9/11, a lot of people, perhaps myself included, over-aggregated the enemy. We saw it all as Al-Qaeda. If you go back and look at the articles and sort of the types of things that were lumped into the Al-Qaeda label, and the places where people saw Al-Qaeda, for example, Reuven book, Al-Qaeda is everywhere. It's like this giant organization. And what we've learned is that was not true. That was not the case. It was much more complicated than that. And and the picture is no less kind of simple today. It's evolved. And of course, there has been some kind of amalgamations and so on. The bottom line is that this is a very heterogeneous phenomenon, and the different parts of it have different preferences, and the different parts of it pose different threats to different people. We have to take this reality into consideration. That's kind of my first point. And the second main point my objection to Boaz's is that I feel that we don't consider sufficiently the dilemma between counter-terrorism, kind of reducing capabilities of group, and the fact that those very reactions can create grievances in their own right. That is the fundamental dilemma in counter-terrorism that we have to think about. And it's this dilemma that is at the heart of the IS debate. If Peter, if I understand you correctly, and I, by the way, agree 99% with what you're saying about the best way to tackle IS. But I think the reason Peter says people were recommending aggressive containment instead of kind of a bold, full-scale attack on IS to kind of finish them once and for all is that he and I assume
containment. That's the term. Interesting.
But like a full invasion, my best assessment of it is not going to work. It's going to be counterproductive. It's going to get Western forces stuck there for many, many years in the way it got us stuck in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we have no reason to believe it's going to be easier this time. None. So, given the lack of better options, this containment approach and waiting for it to go inside is the least bad one. Let's keep it.
Yes, I said it. Do you have a question?
Yes, why don't we open it up since it's already past 4?
I have a question for Peter.
Yeah.
Thinking that Belgium is kind of screwed in the way it can respond to that's a crude way of putting it, but it is kind of screwed because of their own problem of sectarianism between the Flemish and the Dutch, and it's like creating this messy bureaucratic structure that simply can't keep track, for example, of those 120 returnees. So
yeah, but
that's.
I think it goes beyond the messy structure. Even if it was a united, centrally governed state, it wouldn't have the sort of security agencies that are capable, in terms of manpower, of monitoring these people. It's too big for a country like Belgium, even if it was.
But you do accept that the sectarianism they have is a problem.
Well, I mean,
it's quite a big problem.
I'm not an expert on Belgium per se, but I heard that in Brussels alone they have 19 different mayors because they couldn't agree on a mayor.
Right. So
Clearly this creates a lot of difficulties and problems for sure.
Yeah, I think this is what I see as more of the problem here in terms of
Yeah.
Yes.
I just.
Could you please just identify yourself? Could you please just identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Ewan Grant. I'm the former UK Customs Intelligence Analyst for transnational organised crime, and after I left in 2010, I was involved in a project assessing the effectiveness of information exchanges between law enforcement agencies in the European Union. And when we gave our presentation, certainly Frontex were there, I'm pretty sure Europol were there, two member states representatives in the commission. A Belgian police officer made a comment, which I said to him afterwards was the most important thing that the entire project had heard, which was, it's all very well going on about exchanging the information between the databases. It's the information that isn't in the databases. So Mr. Neumann should really be appointed, Professor Neumann should really be appointed the next Europol. I'm quite serious about that. Do you see any signs that this is being taken seriously? A country like Belgium, small, with no natural borders, with people speaking the same language on both sides of the borders, just cannot, it doesn't matter, this would apply to any country, just simply cannot control these challenges. And do you see any signs of people in the corridors of power waking up to this? Because of, I really cannot exaggerate. If the public knew the reality of what's going on in European Commission Brussels and pan-European institutions, they would be very, very worried. And I'm not just talking about lack of capacity and lack of cooperation. I'm going beyond that. Do you think there are signs or have been signs since last year of a wake-up?
I think there is a lot of movement. There has been a lot of movement. Sadly, this is how it works all the time after Paris. And so suddenly, a lot of things that I was being told were completely impossible are suddenly possible now. And so I'm, tragically hopeful that there will be some movement. However, just to elaborate on that point, since you were talking about it, in the case of Europol, they do have, they created a foreign fighter database in, I think, 2013. That foreign fighter database contains 1,400 names. If you look at the database that ICSR has, it actually contains 800 names. So a team of 3 people sitting here at ICSR, using only Facebook and Twitter, has been able to generate half as many names as all the police forces in Europe combined. I think that's an absolute scandal. Okay. And considering that we are estimating that there are between now 5,000 or 6,000 people from Western Europe who have gone to Syria and to Iraq, it doesn't even contain all their names. So how are European police forces supposed to know who is going and who is not going when the central database only actually contains a quarter of the actual names of people who are believed to have gone? The reason is, I was told, there are many reasons. Some countries just simply do not collaborate with Europol, they're refusing, or they're too lazy, or they have whatever reason not to provide names. In other countries, the problem is that the names are actually with the intelligence services rather than with the police forces. The police forces do not necessarily have the names. So if you have an agency like Europol, which is a police agency, you will never be able to know the full list of names that is in the possession of the intelligence services. And that is the one issue where I was told yesterday. Now suddenly, after Paris, this has now been changed. And so these artificial boundaries are now being broken down so they can get all the names that they need. But the fact that this didn't happen until 2 weeks ago is...
I thought your comment about the organised crime free if it's been reported accurately, which is a big if, the report of the detection of the Kalashnikovs from the Montenegrin, that sounds suspiciously like that has been something that has been treated as an organised crime issue, rather than when weapons of that nature are found, that needs to go with everyone.
All right.
If that is an accurate report.
Let's take a series of questions. Let's take 3 questions here. The gentleman, please identify yourself.
Sure. I'm Andrew, I'm a master's student here, and I'd like to ask a bit about framing. So I'm sure everyone here agrees that it's very important to challenge and discredit the violent Islamist ideology that we're dealing with. But a big part of that is going to be the story that we tell. And I'm not sure, is framing it as a war between, competing models of civilization helpful? Is focusing on the theological aspect of it, negating the wider story of, a sort of a model of society that people can aspire to live in here, as opposed to simply focusing on discrediting the ideology that is underpinning through it.
Okay. The gentleman, what is?
My name is Konstantinos Provias. I'm a student of Professor Neumann in Terrorism, Security and Society Masters Program, and also a lieutenant of the Greek Coast Guard. I have a question, short question for Dr. Hegghammer. I apologize. Yes. We know that secret services get a lot of intelligence from these open sources that you refer. If we start policing and narrow it and close them down, wouldn't we make the job of the secret services harder if we assume that they now gather information? And I have another question about Professor Neumann. 10 days ago, 11 days ago, the Ministers of Interior of the European Union, they said that they discussed about an EU CIA, as it was written in newspapers. Do you think that this is possible? And if it is, do you think that it is capable, would be more efficient? Thank you.
And let's get Yassine also.
When we're discussing the question of how we can beat the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, well, I think what's the most likely scenario is that the caliphate is going to, collapse, but not the Islamic State as such. And what happened in 2002 in Afghanistan was that Bin Laden told his people, everybody go home and complete the work there. And we had a sustained bombing campaign in Saudi Arabia as a result, for example, at the beginnings of AQAP. We had similar things in other regions in the world. And this is what I suggest would probably happen in the case of a collapse of the caliphate proper. And if we look at the Sinai and the bombing of the Russian jet, that actually is a pretty dangerous prospect, I think, because what they have shown already in the Sinai is that, the politics currently employed by the Sisi government, for example, are not necessarily very helpful in combating terrorism. So while we are looking at what we can do in Europe, what's happening elsewhere in the world is going to decide the future of global jihadism and its capabilities as well. And I would like to hear your comments on that, for example, with view to the Sisi policies driving the Muslim Brotherhood underground and probably into the hands of a violent jihadist movement, something that we've seen 25 years ago in the rise of Al-Qaeda.
Why don't we start maybe with Boaz?
Okay. I will refer to the same question and to the framing of war. The question of what should be the doctrine of each state towards the challenges that they have internally differs with the level of risk they are posing. From the point of view of Assisi, the Muslim Brotherhood, which supported the Salafists, actually joined hand with them after the election, and definitely didn't prevent, actually flamed, I would say, the situation in Sinai. Is a very dangerous organization as such. We have different types of Muslim Brotherhood in different parts of the world based on the same ideology, but nevertheless have a different way to refer to them. And in contrast to the Sisi policy, you have the Western led by Obama policy, which is, let's just offer democracy to different countries around the world, i.e. Egypt for that matter, and everything will be solved. I beg to differ. Not that I do not support democracy, not that I don't think that every human being around the world has the right to live in a democracy, but democracy is not just an election system. Democracy is a set of values. It's the combination of a civil society, liberal values, the rights of minorities, and so on. And this is something that needed to be observed by different communities. Not every community can be offered by democracy, and then we are going to live in peace all over the world. That's the simplistic way of understanding democracy and of understanding the challenges that we are facing. And by the way, this is, the United States, this is a bipartisan program. A, to believe that democracy is a miracle solution for terrorism, violence, and every atrocity around the world. And B, that free election, this is what democracy is all about. Free election is a crucial element of democracy, but without all the rest that I mentioned before, it's a very dangerous apparatus. So I tend to believe, at least based on my belief, that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is a very, very dangerous movement. Supported terrorism, promoted terrorism. If they will be in power, they will promote terrorism, not just in Egypt, all over the world. By the way, the first thing that they demanded, Morsi demanded from President Obama was to free the blind sheikh, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, and so on and so forth. So, so I do understand that under certain circumstances, Assisi needs to react the way that he reacted. I would not condemn him for what he did on this specific subject. As for the question of the framing, is it a war or it's not a war? Well, it's important to have framing. It's important to have a story to tell, but it's important that the story will fit the situation. Because if we don't do that, then we're telling a story to ourselves. And yes, unfortunately, we are now in a war situation. Some people refer to that as the Third World War. I tend to believe that's the Third World War. Why? Because it's involved so many countries altogether. But it's not the Third World War as we used to understand the First and the Second World War. Because this is a war of ideas. It's a war between concepts. It's a war between ideologies. And it's a war, first and foremost, within, as I referred before, within the religion of Islam. So is it a war? Yes, it's a war. And I know, by the way, who's going to win this war. Write it down. The one who are going to win the war are the Muslims. Because it's a war within Islam. The question that I ask, which Muslims are going to win this war? Would it be the one who represents what I believe is the real Islam, which is the majority, thanks God, of this religion, or the vocal, dangerous, Salafist, jihadist, Islamists that want to take over Islam? Now the question, how do we contribute that those guys would win this war and not the other one?
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, well, first of all, Boaz, I'm very pleased to note that you are the Hassan al-Banna of democratization. Not the Qutbist of democratization. So the question, yeah, frames, narratives. I generally don't have much time for that kind of thing. I think it's mostly a waste of time because nobody can agree on it. In any one government, there will be, as many opinions about what it should be as there are individuals, and there are, lots of government agencies in lots of different countries who will never ever agree on the matter. I think, though, it's important to be aware of the kind of the power of rhetoric and the kind of the pitfalls, and we should avoid saying the really wrong things, but kind of within a bound of kind of reasonable language. I think it really doesn't matter very much. And also, I think we have powerful industries that do this for us. The film industry, the media, music, culture. Kind of our culture promotion is done by the private sector. Steer. On the dilemma between collection and denial on the internet, I think it's No, this has been debated for many years. It was a big debate in the mid-late 2000s when it would actually have been possible to close down everything. But now we're nowhere near that point. So, but I think a good balance, can be struck by trimming the propaganda operation. You can kind of channel the traffic into a limited number of platforms or sites, and then use those as prisons for monitoring what's going on. But what we cannot have is what's happening now. 200 different platforms where lots of things are going on. No service has the resources to monitor all this at the same time.
So narrow it first and then monitor.
Yes. On Egypt and post IS world, yeah, there will be. The biggest effects will, I think, be felt in the region, more so than in the West. And other than Tunisia, there really isn't much to be optimistic about in the region. I think what's happened in Egypt, it may have been good in the short term. I think it's my gut feeling and kind of my knowledge of history tells me this is a disastrous policy for the long term.
All right, very briefly, because I think we're running out, on the EU CIA question. And I don't want to, in this country I'm always very careful because there's already enough anti-European sentiment out there, so I don't want to feed the beast to some extent. But I bet with you publicly £100 now that it will never happen. So I don't think it's ever going to be.
Do we have time to make one more question? Final question, lady in the back.
Now we know that they've got some weaknesses. We find out about this division between ISIS and Al-Shabaab because each of them want to control their territory. Can we use those weaknesses to defeat
Do you mean Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda?
All of them.
Okay. So can we exploit the differences between ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
Scholar King. Well, generally, in the world of terrorism and rebellion, yeah, it's a good thing to try and divide and rule. I think there are many historical examples of organizations that have broken up internally, that have been weakened because of internal schisms of various kinds. Whatever we can do to promote, reinforce those positions is good. What I'm little less sure about is whether it works at kind of at the, for pre-existing organizational divides. I'm thinking out loud here, but I think, if there is a divide, then the work has already been done in a sense, and the competition can kind of play out itself. What the thing to watch, I think, is the kind of the reverse of that is look for signs of mergers and try and prevent mergers. I think a future merger between Al-Qaeda and ISIS is certainly not impossible. I would think the likelihood is more than 50% will happen in the next 5 years. It's not inevitable, but I think it's certainly possible, and that is something we should work to avoid. not sure exactly how.
Can I just, one last thing that only partially relates to your question, but is interesting, and it's also relating to something that, that Thomas said before. If you have time and you want to look up the 2011 US Counter-Terrorism strategy that was published by John Brennan in the spring of 2011, you see, to some extent, an explanation for why Western governments were so surprised, and also experts were so surprised by the rapid rise of ISIS. Because that document actually was the pinnacle of what I think everyone now agrees was a misconceived way of looking at this phenomenon. Because it basically talked not about the jihadist phenomenon, it talked about Al-Qaeda. And every jihadist in the world was divided into Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda Central, Al-Qaeda affiliates, and Al-Qaeda supporters. So there was no way you could be a jihadist without being either a supporter, affiliate, or a full member of Al-Qaeda. And of course, if you then conceive of the entire movement as Al-Qaeda, then you're missing out other things that are happening. For example, the emergence of a group that calls itself Islamic State. And I do think that is to some extent an explanation for why the Americans, but not only the Americans, that view was very widespread at the time in governments, but also amongst experts. I can tell you dozens of think tank reports, which until 2012, 2013, American Enterprises, what's the name of her? Zimmerman or whatever?
Original friends.
Catherine
Zimmerman, yeah. She was, in 2013, she was still basically using that framework of conceiving of the jihadist movement. And I think there was a collective failure of a lot of analysts to conceive of that movement as more diverse and of people not necessarily having a relationship with Al-Qaeda, that not everything was defined by Al-Qaeda. I remember being in Herzliya in 2013 with a discussion with you, Assaf, and with, were you there?
Yes, and
yeah.
David.
And we were, the key question was, of all these groups that are emerging now across the Middle East, who is going to be the next Al-Qaeda affiliate? As if that mattered to these groups. You know, like Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia and Libya, are they going to affiliate with Al-Qaeda very soon? That's what we debated, as if that was the most critical question. I don't think it is, and I don't think anyone anymore believes that affiliation with Al-Qaeda is the key question to be answered. I do think that both analysts and governments sort of suffered from a sort of a tunnel vision, where everything was seen through the prism of Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda and jihadism were basically treated as one and the same thing. We now know, as Boaz pointed out, that is a much wider phenomenon. And I do think that it explains to some extent the reason why many people were not as taking ISIS as seriously as they should have been taken when they finally emerged.
Can I just want to maybe just one comment. I very much agree with you, Peter. And I would just say that as a logical follow-on to that is we shouldn't only focus on ISIS.
I'm including myself in that group.
Yeah, but and today I think the same is true for today. We shouldn't only focus on ISIS, you know, and without seeing the broader picture.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah, that was my question. I mean, do you think we're doing the same thing again today?
I think we're getting there. We're getting there, but at least we're not at conferences like this. We're talking about competition, cooperation, mergers, you know, the sort of things that you were talking about. I think there's a more sophisticated view, but I mean, obviously it took a long time to get there.
Thank you very much. Please help me thank the panelists. And,